Finally. Her mother's voice carried through the closed door, bright with relief. 26 years of managing that girl, and finally someone's willing to take her off our hands. Clara's hand froze on the staircase railing. Her father didn't argue, didn't defend her, just said quietly, "When does Thornton arrive?" "Thursday." She stood there and let the truth land, not like a wound, but like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was keeping her trapped. She walked back upstairs, pulled out her trunk, and started packing. Not because a man had chosen her, because she had finally chosen herself. If this story already speaks to your heart, subscribe to our channel, follow every part until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Caleb Thornton's letter arrived at the Whitmore household. Clara was elbow deep in the vegetable garden, pulling up the last of the autumn carrots, when she heard her mother scream. Not a scream of alarm, not a scream of grief, a scream of pure, unrestrained joy, the kind her mother usually reserved for her younger sister Eleanor's piano recitals, or the announcement that her sister Josephine had received yet another proposal from yet another eligible young man in town. Clara sat back on her heels and wiped the dirt from her hands onto her apron. She waited. She had learned in 26 years of living in this house that her mother's screams almost never had anything to do with her. She was right. "Richard! Richard, come quickly!" Her mother's voice bounced off every wall of the house. "A letter from Caleb Thornton, up on the mountain. You know the one, the rancher, the one who never comes to town. He's written to us, Richard. He has written to us." Clara heard her father's heavy footsteps crossing the parlor floor. She heard the rustle of paper. She heard silence, the particular kind of silence that happens when adults are reading something they don't want overheard. Then she heard her father say very quietly and very deliberately, "Well, I'll be damned." She pulled another carrot from the ground. They did not tell her at breakfast. Her mother sat at the head of the table with the expression of a woman who has just won a card game and is savoring the moment before she lays her hand down. Her father kept his eyes on his plate. Eleanor, who was 19 and already had 2 serious admirers, chattered about a dress she wanted for the upcoming harvest dance. Josephine, the youngest and everyone's favorite, was allowed to eat cake with her porridge because she had a delicate constitution and was never refused anything. Clara ate her eggs, drank her coffee, and said nothing. She had learned that too, how to occupy space in this house without drawing attention to herself, how to be present without being noticed, how to watch and listen and understand everything that was happening around her while appearing to be thinking of nothing at all. It was a skill her mother called coldness. Clara called it survival. After breakfast, when the girls were dismissed, and Clara was already halfway down the hall toward the back door and the rest of the garden, her mother's voice stopped her. "Clara, come into the parlor. Your father and I need to speak with you." She turned slowly. Her mother was smiling the wide, slightly too bright smile she used in church and at dinner parties, the smile that meant she was performing happiness for an audience rather than feeling it. Clara followed her into the parlor. The letter was on the side table, folded precisely. Her father stood near the window with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Her mother settled herself onto the settee with the deliberate grace of a woman arranging a portrait of herself. "Sit down, Clara." She sat. "We have received a rather extraordinary correspondence," her mother began. "From Caleb Thornton. You know who he is, of course, the rancher up on Ridgeback Mountain. He came into some land from his father, built the whole thing up by himself. Very successful from what everyone says, though he's not the sort of man who attends many social functions." "I know who he is," Clara said. She did. Everyone in the valley knew who Caleb Thornton was in the distant mythological way they knew about weather patterns and mountain ranges as a force rather than a person. He was 34 or 35, she thought. He had been briefly engaged years ago to a woman from Helena who had changed her mind about ranch life after one winter. Since then, he had apparently decided that marriage was not a priority. "He has written to express his interest," her mother continued, "in a union with a member of this family." There was a pause, the theatrical kind, the kind her mother used for maximum effect. "He has specifically requested you." Clara waited for the rest of the sentence. The part that explained why this was a problem. The part that revealed the catch. Her mother's smile remained wide and bright and perfectly arranged. "Well," her father said from the window, "what do you think?" "I think," Clara said carefully, "that I'd like to read the letter." The letter was 3 paragraphs long and written in a hand that was plain and direct. No flourishes, no excessive courtesy. Caleb Thornton wrote the way she imagined he spoke, without ornamentation. I explained that he was a rancher with a working mountain property, and that he required a partner capable of managing a difficult life honestly and without complaint. He had over the past 2 years made quiet inquiries about various women in the surrounding valleys, and had received on more than one occasion a description of Clara Whitmore as a woman of unusual practical intelligence and personal fortitude. He acknowledged that this was an unconventional approach and that he had no interest in pressuring anyone into a situation they found unsuitable. He said plainly that he would arrive in 3 days to make her acquaintance, and that if she wished him gone, she had only to say so, and he would leave without argument. At the bottom of the letter, in slightly smaller writing, as though it were an afterthought that had nearly been left out, "I am not looking for a woman who will adapt herself to my expectations. I am looking for a woman who has expectations of her own." Clara read the letter twice. Then she folded it exactly as she had found it and set it back on the side table. "All right," she said. "I'll meet him." Her mother released a breath so large it nearly rearranged the curtains. "Wonderful. That's just wonderful, Clara, really. We'll get your green dress altered. The waist needs taking in, and I think we ought to do something with your hair before—" "I'll wear what I wear," Clara said. "He'll see what he's getting, or there's no point." The bright smile flickered. Clara excused herself, and went back to the garden. She heard them that night. She had not meant to. She was coming downstairs for a glass of water the way she often did when she couldn't sleep, and she was at the bottom of the stairs before she realized her parents were still in the parlor with the lamp burning low, and that they were talking about her in the particular unguarded way people talk about subjects when they believe themselves to be alone. She stopped on the last step. "Honestly, Richard, I feel as though we've been holding our breath for 6 years, waiting for this to happen. 6 years since she turned down the Morrison boy, and every year since then, just another year of managing her." "She didn't suit the Morrison boy," her father said. His voice was quieter than her mother's flatter. "She didn't try to suit him, that's the problem. She never tries. She just is. Difficult and opinionated, and you know what Margaret Fenton said to me at the church social last spring," she said, "Francis. I don't know how you live with her. My own neighbor said that about my own daughter." "Clara works harder than any of the girls," her father said. But his voice was the voice of a man making a point he doesn't expect to win. "Oh, I know she works. I've never disputed that she works. But a daughter isn't just a pair of hands, Richard. A daughter is a reflection, and Clara has never once—" Her mother stopped, seemed to collect herself. Then more quietly, "When Thornton's letter arrived this morning, my very first thought before anything else was relief. I felt relieved, and I'm not ashamed to say it. If he takes her and she's happy there, and she finally has somewhere she fits, then everyone benefits." A pause. "Including us," her father said. Not a question. "Including us," her mother agreed. "Is that so terrible to admit?" Clara stood on the last step and did not move and did not breathe. She had known this. She had known it the way you know things that are never directly said, in the architecture of 1,000 small moments, in the way her mother's face relaxed when she left a room, in the way her father never quite met her eyes when the other girls were being praised. She had known it in her bones. But knowing something and hearing it spoken aloud are entirely different kinds of pain. She went back upstairs without the water. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a very long time. Then she got up, lit the lamp, and began making a list of everything she would need to pack. Caleb Thornton arrived on a Tuesday morning in a wagon that had seen hard use and made no apologies for it. Clara watched from the upstairs window as he climbed down from the driver's seat, a tall man, lean rather than heavy, with the particular kind of deliberate movements that belong to people who have spent years working in conditions where carelessness costs something real. He wore a dark coat that was well made, but not new. His hat was pulled against the October wind. He tied the horses himself without looking around to see if anyone was watching. He did not look like the man performing his arrival. He looked like a man who had somewhere to be and was simply getting there. Her mother appeared on the porch in her best day dress, with the warm, welcoming smile she kept in reserve for important guests. Clara could hear the performance of hospitality beginning. 2 floors below, the bright voice, the gracious invitation, the careful orchestration of first impressions. She straightened her own dress, her ordinary work-capable honest dress, and went downstairs. The parlor had been arranged with the tactical precision her mother applied to all social encounters. The good china was out. Josephine and Eleanor were positioned on the love seat like decorative bookends, both in their prettiest afternoon dresses. Her father stood near the mantel. Her mother was already gesturing Caleb Thornton toward the best chair. Howe was larger in person than he had seemed from the window. Not in the intimidating way, but in the way of someone who simply occupied their own space completely, without shrinking or expanding to suit the room. He looked around the parlor, once briefly taking it in the way a practical man assesses any new environment. His eyes moved across her mother, her father, her sisters, and stopped on Clara, who was standing in the doorway. She had not arranged herself for this moment. She was simply there, standing still, watching him the way she had watched everything her whole life, carefully, directly, without the performance of pleasantness. Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't have named it precisely. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Thornton," she said. Her mother inserted herself smoothly. "Shall we all sit? I'll have Margaret bring the tea." "If it's all the same," Caleb said without taking his eyes off Clara. "I'd rather speak with Miss Whitmore directly, if she's willing." The parlor went slightly quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something unexpected has happened. Her mother's smile remained in place through what appeared to be considerable personal effort. "Of course. Clara, why don't you take Mr. Thornton through to the back sitting room?" "The garden," Clara said. "If you don't mind, I think more clearly outside." Caleb Thornton almost, not quite, but almost smiled. "Lead the way," he said. The garden in October was not at its best. The flower beds were cleared and turned the vegetable rows bare, the apple tree dropping its last leaves in the gray morning wind. It was not a pretty garden. It was a working garden, and at this time of year it showed its bones honestly. Clara walked to the middle of it and turned to face him. "You should know," she said before he could speak, "that I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not in order to make a good impression. If that's what you're hoping for, you've come a long way for a disappointment." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "My mother has probably told you, or will tell you, that I'm difficult. My neighbors have opinions about my personality. I have been described as too outspoken, too independent, too practical, and not sufficiently concerned with what people think of me." She paused. "Most of those things are accurate." "I read about you," he said. "Before I wrote the letter, I asked people who knew you." "And what did they say?" "That you were the most capable woman in this valley, and the least likely to let anyone know it. That you once fixed a broken wheel on the Hendersons' wagon when their hired man said it couldn't be done. That you kept your family's kitchen garden producing through the drought 3 summers ago when everyone else's failed. That you argued with the county clerk about a property assessment and turned out to be right." He paused. "They also said you were exhausting. They're not wrong about that either." "I'm not looking for easy," he said. "Easy doesn't last a winter on Ridgeback Mountain." She studied him. He stood in the October wind without impatience, without performance, without the slightly desperate energy men sometimes brought to these encounters, the urgency of needing something from her. He seemed instead entirely comfortable with silence. "Why me?" she asked. "Specifically. Not my sisters, not someone younger or less." She searched for the word complicated. "Because I've buried 2 hired men and a business partner in 11 years, he said simply. "And in every case when I think about what went wrong, it wasn't capability I was missing. It was honesty. I needed people who would tell me when I was about to make a mistake, and instead, I had people who told me what they thought I wanted to hear." He looked at her directly. "From everything I was told, you are constitutionally incapable of telling people what they want to hear." "That's one way to put it," Clara said. I meant it as a recommendation. She was quiet for a moment. I need to tell you something, she said. And I need you to understand that I'm not saying it for sympathy. I'm saying it because if we're going to have any kind of honest conversation, you should know the facts. Go ahead. My family is relieved to see me go. Not because they're cruel people necessarily. My mother, in particular, genuinely believes she's doing the right thing, but because I have never been what they needed me to be, and the gap between what I am and what they wanted has cost everyone a great deal of energy over a great many years. She said it flatly without self-pity. I'm telling you this because if you take me north and then decide 6 months in that you've made a mistake, I will not have anywhere to come back to. Not really. And I'd rather know that before I pack my trunk than discover it after. Caleb Thornton was quiet for a long moment. I'm not going to tell you that won't happen, he said finally. I can't promise you the future. Nobody can. He paused. But I will tell you this, I don't make decisions carelessly, and I don't reverse them for comfort. If I bring you to that ranch, it's because I believe you belong there, and I don't operate on belief lightly. And if I decide it's not right for me, she asked, if I get there and realize I can't do it, then I drive you back myself, he said. No argument. Your choice is your choice. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. All right, you'll come. All right, I'll see the ranch, she said. And then I'll decide. This time he did smile just briefly, just at the corner of his mouth. Fair enough. She told her mother that evening. I'm going north to see the property, she said. I haven't agreed to anything yet, but I'm willing to consider it. Her mother's relief was so immediate and so physical that it passed across her face like weather before she could compose it back into the appropriate maternal concern. Of course, darling, of course. It's a very sensible decision. Mr. Thornton seems like a stable man, very— You don't need to sell it to me, Clara said. I said I'm going. That's enough. Her mother stopped, looked at her. Something moved in her expression that might in different circumstances have been mistaken for regret. Clara. I heard you, Clara said quietly. Last night, on the stairs. The silence that followed was the most honest silence her mother had ever offered her. I'm not angry, Clara said, and she was surprised to find it was true. I think I've known for a long time. I just needed to hear it said so I could stop spending energy hoping otherwise. She paused. I'll write when I'm settled. If I'm settled. She went upstairs, finished her packing, and slept better than she had in years. They left at first light. Her father shook her hand at the door, a thing he had never done before, and the grip of it was longer and firmer than necessary, and he didn't quite meet her eyes, but he held on for a moment before he let go. Josephine was still asleep. Eleanor waved from the upstairs window. Her mother stood on the porch in her morning robe and watched the wagon pull away and did not call after her. Clara sat on the wagon bench beside Caleb Thornton and watched the town of Millhaven fall away behind them as the road climbed toward the mountains, and she felt not happiness exactly. Not yet, but something that might, with enough time and honesty and work, eventually become it. You're quiet, Caleb said after an hour. I'm thinking, she said. About what? She considered. About the difference between leaving somewhere and arriving somewhere. I've been thinking about leaving for a long time. I haven't spent much time thinking about what comes after. What do you want to come after? She thought about the letter. I am not looking for a woman who will adapt herself to my expectations. I am looking for a woman who has expectations of her own. Something real, she said. I've spent my whole life managing other people's comfort. I'd like to do something that matters, something I'm actually good at. You'll have plenty of that, he said. The ranch doesn't leave much room for anything else. Is that a warning? It's a fact. I prefer facts, she said. I know, he said. That was another recommendation. The road curved upward, and the mountains opened ahead of them, enormous and indifferent, and absolutely real, and Clara Whitmore, who had spent 26 years being told she was too much and not enough. In the same breath, leaned forward slightly into the wind, and felt for the first time in as long as she could remember, like herself. They stopped at midday to rest the horses at a creek crossing, and it was there that Clara got her first real conversation with Caleb Thornton, the kind that happens not in parlors, but in outdoor spaces where there's enough room to be honest. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. She had filled her canteen and was sitting on a flat rock while he checked the horse's shoes. "Not the good parts, the parts that make people leave." He looked up at her with something that might have been appreciation. "The winters," he said. "They're not like valley winters. The cold has weight up there. It presses on you, and it doesn't relent. Some people can't bear it psychologically. They need company and warmth and the reassurance of other people nearby and on Ridgeback Mountain. There are weeks in January and February when you don't see another living soul outside the ranch hands. I grew up with people around me constantly," Clara said. "It was not an advantage." "The work is unrelenting," he continued. "There's no such thing as a day off during calving season or harvest. When something breaks, and something always breaks, it gets fixed regardless of weather or time of day. I understand work, and I'll be honest with you about something else." He straightened up, turned to face her directly. "I'm not easy to live with. I don't talk much. I'm not comfortable with arrangements that involve a great deal of social performance. If you're expecting warmth and conversation and someone who makes the house feel cheerful, you're going to be disappointed." Clara looked at him steadily. "Are you warning me away?" "I'm being accurate." "Then I'll be accurate too," she said. "I don't need cheerful. I've been surrounded by people performing happiness my entire life, and I find it exhausting. What I need is honest. What I need is to be treated as though my opinion matters and my work counts for something." She paused. "Can you offer me that?" "A beat." "Yes," he said. "That I can offer." "Then we're probably compatible enough to try," she said. The ranch appeared in the late afternoon, not gradually, but all at once, as the road crested a ridge and the whole sweep of it opened below a working spread of buildings and fenced pasture. The main house solid and unpretentious against the mountain backdrop. Smoke rising from one of the outbuildings where someone was already at work despite the failing light. Clara looked at it for a long time without speaking. It was not beautiful in the way of paintings. It was beautiful in the way of things that are exactly what they are: undecorated, functional, durable. "Well," Caleb said. "It looks like a place where things actually happen," she said. "They do," he said. "From 4 in the morning until after dark every day." "Good," said Clara Whitmore, who had spent 26 years in a house where the primary activity was the management of appearances. "Show me where I'll be working." And Caleb Thornton, who had lived alone on this mountain for 6 years, waiting for someone who wouldn't flinch at the truth of it, clicked to the horses and drove her down. The ranch hand who met them at the gate was a weathered man in his 50s named Pete Garvey, who had the look of someone who had seen enough of the world to stop being impressed by most of it. He glanced at Clara with frank, unvarnished curiosity as Caleb climbed down from the wagon. "This is Miss Clara Whitmore," Caleb said. "She'll be staying at the ranch." Pete's eyes moved over her once, not unkindly, simply assessingly, the way a man looks at a new horse to determine its practical worth. "Where's she staying?" "The north bedroom in the main house." Pete looked at Clara directly. "You know anything about cattle?" "I know the theory," Clara said. "I'm willing to learn the practice." "Theory don't count for much when it's 2 in the morning and a heifer's in trouble," Pete said. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. Which is why I'd rather learn from someone who knows what they're doing than pretend I already do." Pete looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Something passed between them that Clara couldn't read. "Dinner's in an hour," Pete said, and walked back toward the barn. Caleb picked up her trunk. "That went well," he said. "Did it?" "He didn't tell you to leave," Caleb said. For Pete, that's practically a warm welcome. The main house was larger inside than it appeared from the road, built for practicality rather than display, with wide plank floors and solid furniture, and a kitchen that was the clear heart of the space, organized around function rather than appearance. Clara walked through it slowly, touching nothing, taking everything in. "The north bedroom," Caleb said, setting her trunk at the foot of the stairs. There's a lock on the door. The key's on the dresser. She looked at him. I want you to understand, he said carefully, and without apparent embarrassment, that nothing is expected of you that you haven't agreed to. You're here to see the ranch. Whatever else happens, happens at your pace and by your choice. That's not going to change. All right, she said. All right, you believe me, or all right, you're too tired to argue. All right, I believe you, she said. I'm a good judge of men who are lying, and you don't appear to be. What do I appear to be? She considered him standing at the bottom of the stairs in his working coat, entirely without artifice, entirely without the social machinery that most men use to manage women's impressions of them. Honest, she said, possibly to a fault. Probably, he agreed. She picked up her trunk, he moved to take it, and she gave him a look that stopped him and carried it up the stairs herself. Behind her, she heard what might have been a very quiet laugh. It was the first real sound of warmth she had heard from him, and it landed somewhere in her chest like an unexpected match strike. She kept walking up the stairs and told herself firmly that she was here to evaluate a practical arrangement and that warmth was not data. But in the north bedroom, turning the key in the lock that he had thought to mention without being asked, she sat on the edge of the bed and breathed the cold mountain air coming through the window crack, and thought about a man who had read her character from second-hand accounts, traveled 2 days to meet her, offered her a choice before he offered her anything else, and laughed quietly. Privately, not at her expense, but at the situation's honest absurdity, and she decided that perhaps, just perhaps, she had not made a mistake. She would know more in the morning. The mountain was already dark outside the window, and the stars. This high up were extraordinary, thick and close and completely indifferent to the small and complicated lives of the people beneath them. Clara Whitmore looked at them for a long time. Then she lay down in her clothes and slept dreamlessly for the first time in years. She was awake before the ranch. That was the first thing Clara learned about Ridgeback Mountain. The cold arrived before everything else. It came through the window crack she'd left open, settled into the floorboards, climbed the bedposts, and had her fully conscious before the sky had decided what color it wanted to be. She lay still for exactly 30 seconds the way she had trained herself to do in the Whitmore house, when getting up too early meant encountering her mother in the kitchen and enduring a conversation she hadn't yet built the armor for. Then she remembered she was not in that house anymore. She was up and dressed in 4 minutes. The kitchen was empty when she came downstairs, but the stove had been banked for the night, and she found the wood box full and the coffee already ground in its tin and the water bucket recently filled, which meant someone had been through here not long before her. She built the fire up without fuss, set the coffee on, and stood at the window while the water heated, looking out at the gray pre-dawn shapes of the outbuildings and the fence lines, and the dark mass of the mountain rising behind everything like a patient fact. She heard boots on the porch steps. The back door opened, and Pete Garvey came in with the cold air rolling off him and stopped when he saw her standing at the stove. They looked at each other. "Coffee's not ready yet," Clara said. 10 minutes. Pete hung his hat on the hook by the door. "You're up early." "I'm always up early." He pulled out a chair and sat at the table with the deliberate movements of a man whose joints had opinions about cold mornings and said nothing further. Clara set out 2 cups and waited on the coffee, and didn't attempt to fill the silence with anything, because she had spent enough years around people who were uncomfortable with quiet to recognize a man who wasn't. When the coffee was ready, she poured both cups and set one in front of him, without asking how he took it. He looked at the cup, then at her. "You didn't ask." "You don't seem like a man who takes it any way but black." A pause. "Been wrong before," he said, but he didn't reach for anything to add to it. She sat down across from him with her own cup and drank her coffee and watched the window lighten by degrees. After a while, Pete said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Town woman. Soft hands and a lot of opinions about how things ought to be arranged differently." "I do have opinions about how things ought to be arranged," Clara said, "but I check whether I know what I'm talking about first." Pete made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. "Caleb tell you what the day looks like?" "He told me the ranch is a working spread and that I'd have plenty to do. He didn't give me a schedule." You get a schedule when you've been here long enough to know what needs doing without being told. He wrapped both hands around his cup. Today, you can follow me. It was Clara understood both a test and an offer. She recognized it for what it was and accepted it for what it was. All right, she said. The morning was unrelenting in the way of all honest work, not cruel, but indifferent to comfort or fatigue or inexperience. Pete moved through the ranch chores with the economy of a man who had done each task so many thousands of times that the motion had bypassed thought entirely and settled directly into muscle. Clara stayed a half step behind and watched and listened and asked questions only when she had exhausted every other way of working something out for herself. She mucked 3 stalls without being asked. She helped carry feed without complaining about the weight. When one of the younger horses shied at something in the corner of the barn and nearly took her off her feet, she steadied herself, steadied the animal and spoke to it in a low, even voice until it stopped trembling. Pete watched that part from the barn door. "Where'd you learn horses?" he asked when she came out. "My uncle had a farm outside Millhaven. I spent summers there until I was 14. She paused. "My mother decided it was making me unsuitable for polite society." Pete snorted. It was his most expressive sound yet. By mid-morning, Clara's back hurt. Her hands were raw from the unfamiliar cold and the work, and she was hungrier than she had been in recent memory. She said none of these things aloud. She simply kept moving. At some point during the morning, Caleb appeared at the fence line where she and Pete were working on a section of post that had shifted in the last freeze. He didn't announce himself, he simply arrived and stood for a moment watching. Clara glanced up, registered his presence, and went back to holding the post steady while Pete worked the tamper. "How's the morning?" Caleb asked. The question was directed somewhere between her and Pete, deliberately neutral. "Fine," Pete said. "Fine," Clara echoed without looking up. There was a brief silence in which she had the distinct impression that Caleb was trying not to smile. Then his footsteps moved away toward the main barn, and she and Pete continued working. "He expected you to last an hour," Pete said conversationally after Caleb was out of earshot. Clara kept her hands on the post. "He said that he didn't have to." Pete drove the tamper down once hard. "I could tell from how he asked me to keep an eye on you." Another drive. The way a man asks you to keep an eye on something tells you how long he thinks it'll last. And how did he ask? Pete considered this with the gravity of a man who says few words and means all of them. Like he figured I'd have my work cut out for me. Clara looked up at him then. "Do you?" Pete looked back at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, what moved across his weathered face was something unambiguously close to respect. "Not so far," he said. Caleb found her in the afternoon in the small room off the kitchen that appeared to serve as a combination storage space and informal office. A table covered in papers, a shelf of ledgers, a coat rack overburdened with functional rather than decorative items. Clara had not been asked to go there. She had wandered in while looking for a particular piece of equipment Pete had mentioned needing, and had then almost involuntarily stopped in front of the papers on the table. They were financial records, she realized. Rough ones written in multiple hands cross-referenced imprecisely with discrepancies that jumped out at her with the particular vividness of errors that have been quietly compounding for some time. She was so absorbed in following one particular thread of numbers that she didn't hear Caleb come in. "Those aren't decorative," he said. She looked up. "I can see that. There's a discrepancy in the feed account. The same amount appears twice in October, 6 days apart. Either someone was billed twice, or the second entry is an error, but either way, it's not reconciled." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed to the table and looked at what she was pointing to. "I've had that same problem 3 times this year," he said. "Can't find where it originates." "It originates here," she said, pointing to a different page. "Whoever is doing the entry is carrying numbers forward without checking the previous total first. It's not malicious, it's just imprecise." A pause. "My last ranch hand kept these," Caleb said carefully. "He might be better with cattle than columns," Clara said. "That's not a criticism, it's practical. Some people are, and some people aren't. Caleb was quiet for a moment, in a way that had a different quality than his usual quiet. Less repose, more thought. "Could you manage the accounts?" he asked. She looked at him directly. "Is that what you're asking me to do here?" "Or manage accounts." "I'm asking if you could," he said. "We can talk about what I'm asking you to do separately." "Yes," she said. "I could manage the accounts. I managed my father's household accounts for 4 years, including 2 years when his business was struggling, and we needed to find economies without anyone knowing we were looking. I'm good with numbers." "Another thing nobody mentioned," Caleb said, half to himself. "People tend not to notice the things that don't make conversation at dinner parties," Clara said. He looked at her, then really looked at her in the direct and unceremonious way he had, as though assessing not her surface, but her architecture. "Why did you stay?" he asked. "In Millhaven. If it was what you've told me, why didn't you leave before this?" It was a fair question. She had asked it herself in darker moments. "Where would I have gone?" she said. "A woman alone without money or connections in 1884. The options are limited. Marriage to someone I don't respect, work as a governess or a seamstress in a strange town, or stay where I knew the terms of my own unhappiness." She paused. "Your letter was the first time an option appeared that was worth the risk of leaving." "Because of the ranch?" he asked. "Because of the last line of your letter," she said. "You said you weren't looking for a woman who would adapt to your expectations." "I've been adapting to other people's expectations my entire life. I'm extraordinarily good at it, and I am completely finished doing it." The room was quiet except for the wind working at the window frame. "Good," said Caleb Thornton. "Then don't." The first real crisis came on the 4th day, without any warning that it was coming. Clara was in this kitchen yard when she heard the shouting from the north pasture. Not alarm exactly, but the particular pitch of men's voices when something has gone wrong and the window for fixing it is closing fast. She didn't wait to understand the details. She ran. What she found when she got there: a yearling calf tangled in downed fence wire, panicking, making the tangle worse with every movement, while 2 of the younger ranch hands stood 3 feet away, debating the best approach and losing precious time. Pete was coming from the barn at a run. Caleb was somewhere on the north ridge. She could hear one of the hands shouting for him. Clara looked at the calf. She looked at the wire. She looked at the 2 young men still debating. "You," she said, pointing to the taller one. "Get on its left side and keep it from rolling. Don't grab it, just block it. You." The second one. "Do you have wire cutters on you?" "In my belt." "Give them to me." She did not wait to see whether this was going to be argued with. She took the cutters crouched in the dirt on the calf's right side and began working the wire in order of what was cutting. Deepest, the way her uncle had taught her to think about tangled things, worst first, then work outward. The calf fought her. She held on. She was on the 3rd strand when she heard Caleb arrive behind her, slightly winded from the ridge. She didn't look up. "I need another 30 seconds. A brief pause. Then, "All right." And he crouched on the other side of the calf without another word, adding his hands to the containment effort, working with her instead of taking over. The last strand came free. The calf scrambled upright, shook itself violently, and bolted 3 feet before deciding its legs worked and stopping to assess the situation with the particular blank dignity of an animal that has no memory of being terrified. Clara sat back on her heels in the dirt with the wire cutters in her hands, and her heart hammering, and her dress, her good work dress, torn at the knee. She became aware that everyone was looking at her. Pete was looking at her. The 2 young hands were looking at her. Caleb was looking at her from 3 feet away, crouched in the dirt on the other side of where the calf had been, and his expression was one she hadn't seen on him before, open, unguarded, doing nothing to conceal itself. "You knew how to do that," he said. "My uncle," she said. "Sheep not cattle, but the principle's the same." "You didn't wait to see if I was coming." "You weren't there," she said simply. "Waiting for you wasn't going to help the calf." Something moved through his expression, something complex that settled eventually into something that looked like recognition. He stood up. "Pete," he said. "Yeah." Pete said in the tone of a man who is confirming something he has suspected. Caleb reached down and offered Clara his hand. She looked at it for a beat. This man who had told her nothing was expected of her, who had offered her a choice before an arrangement, and took it. And he pulled her to her feet with the straightforward ease of someone who pulls fence posts and doesn't calculate the weight. He didn't let go of her hand immediately. She didn't pull it back immediately. Then both of them seemed to notice this at the same time, and she took her hand back, and he turned to look at the repaired fence section, and neither of them said anything about it. But the two ranch hands exchanged a look that meant something, and Pete turned away with the ghost of something on his face that was absolutely a smile. That evening, the atmosphere in the kitchen was different from the nights before. The ranch hands there were 4 who took meals at the main house. Pete and 3 younger men named Tom Carl, and a boy everyone called Ringo, for reasons no one had explained, had previously treated Clara's presence at the dinner table with the cautious, slightly artificial courtesy men apply to women they don't know what to do with. That evening, Carl asked her a direct question about fence maintenance. It was a small thing, but Clara understood it for what it was. She was being consulted, not accommodated. She answered him practically and fully, and he nodded and asked a follow-up, and Pete added something, and Caleb watched from the end of the table with his coffee and said very little, but what he said was measured and useful, and always came at exactly the right moment to advance the conversation rather than redirect it. After dinner, when the hands had gone, and Clara was washing the dishes, she had begun doing this without discussion, because it was a thing that needed doing, and she was there. Caleb stood at the other end of the kitchen and dried them as she passed them also without discussion. They worked in silence for a few minutes. "They're not treating you like a guest anymore," Caleb said. "I noticed. Is that all right with you?" Clara handed him a plate. "It's what I wanted. You want to be treated like a worker. I want to be treated like a person who is actually here and actually useful," she said. "Which in this context means a worker, yes." She paused. "You said you wanted someone honest. Honest means I tell you when something's working and when it isn't. This is working." Caleb dried the plate and set it on the shelf. "What isn't working?" She almost smiled. "The feed account discrepancy is a symptom. The whole bookkeeping system needs rebuilding from the last clean period, probably 18 months ago from what I can see. It's not going to be a small job." He looked at her steadily. "Are you asking my permission to do it or telling me it needs doing?" "Both," she said. "I don't assume authority I haven't been given, but I'm telling you plainly that if someone doesn't fix it, you're going to end up with a significant shortfall that you can't account for by spring." A long pause. "Do it," he said. "Whatever you need, ask Pete or ask me." "All right." "And Clara," she looked at him, "thank you, for this afternoon, for not waiting." She considered the weight of those words. Not the gratitude which was straightforward, but the for not waiting which was specific and meant something larger than a tangled calf. "I wasn't going to stand by while something suffered because the right person wasn't there yet," she said. "That's never made sense to me." Caleb looked at her for a moment, with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one he wore when something had confirmed a belief he had not quite let himself hold. "No," he said quietly. "I don't imagine it has." The letter arrived on her 9th day at the ranch, and it was from her mother. It was 3 pages and said, in the elaborate and somewhat exhausting way her mother communicated everything significant. Essentially, 2 things: that the family was well, and that Clara should not mistake her current situation for permanence until the formal arrangement was settled. "Mr. Thornton is no doubt a fine man," her mother wrote, "but you must be careful not to make yourself so indispensable in a working capacity that he forgets to see you in the other capacity. Men can be very comfortable accepting help without acknowledging the person providing it." Clara read the letter twice, set it on the table in her room. Then she went back to the accounts ledger because there was work to be done and whatever else her mother was or was not right about. Over the years, she had not raised a woman who let correspondence interfere with productivity. It was Pete who found her there an hour later, still at the ledger, and who sat down across from her at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee he hadn't been asked to make, and said in his blunt and entirely well-meaning way, Letter from home. From my mother. Good news or advice you didn't ask for. The second one mostly. Pete wrapped his hands around his cup. She worried about you. Clara thought about it honestly. She's worried about the situation, which is a different thing. Whether it reflects worry about me specifically is complicated. Pete was quiet for a moment. My wife, he said, which was not a sentence she had expected from him, told me something the year before she died that I've thought about near every day since. She said most people love you the way they're capable of loving, not the way you need to be loved. And the sooner you stop waiting for those two things to match, the better off everyone is. Clara looked at him. She was smarter than me, Pete said without any sadness in it. Just factual, just honest. Most women are, in my experience. She sounds like she was, Clara said. They drank their coffee. After a while, Pete said, he's not comfortable, you know. Caleb. With what? With. Pete seemed to look for the right word with the same careful economy he applied to everything. Having someone here who matters. It's been a long time since someone mattered in that house. He's gone careful. Clara absorbed this. I'm not here to pressure anyone into anything. I know that. I think he knows that too. Pete stood, collected his cup. I'm just saying, he's watching. You probably noticed. I noticed, she said. Then you also noticed that he's not watching like a man who's made a business arrangement, Pete said, and walked out. Clara looked at the ledger. The columns of figures sat there patiently waiting to be sorted into truth. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Outside, the mountain wind had picked up in the way it did in the afternoons, at this elevation. Not a gentle sound, but a voice low and constant and absolutely serious. She was beginning to understand why this place made some people leave and made others, the right kind, need to stay. She was beginning to understand which kind she was. On her 12th day, Caleb asked her to ride the northern fence line with him. It was practical. A section of fence had been reported damaged by one of the hands who'd been up that way the day before, and 2 sets of eyes were better than one for assessing the extent of it. But Clara had been on this ranch long enough now to understand the difference between practical requests and requests that were also other things. She saddled her own horse. He noticed that without commenting on it. They rode north in the pale morning cold, and for the first mile or so, they talked about nothing but fence, the way experienced ranch people talk about maintenance, with the matter-of-fact thoroughness of people who understand that the small problems are where the large problems hide. Then Caleb said without preamble, "Tell me about something you're good at that no one knows." She glanced at him. "You first." A pause, surprised, she thought, or as close to surprised as he allowed himself to show. "Fair," he said. He thought for a moment genuinely. I can remember a conversation word for word years later. Not useful exactly, but I've never forgotten anything anyone said to me that mattered. That sounds both useful and painful, she said. Accurate, he said. Your turn. She considered what to tell him and decided on the truth as she always decided. I can read people's intentions faster than they can hide them. I've always been able to. My mother thought it was an anti-social quality. It makes people uncomfortable to be understood before they've chosen what to show you. She paused. But it means I very rarely get surprised by who someone turns out to be. Caleb was quiet for a moment. And who am I turning out to be? The horses moved steadily beneath them, and the mountain was around them on all sides, and Clara thought about the man who had offered her a choice before an arrangement, who had offered a lock and a key, before expectations, who had dried dishes without discussion, and said thank you for not waiting, with the precise weight of someone who meant more than the words could hold. Exactly what you appear to be, she said, which is rarer than you might think. Something shifted in the air between them. Small, significant, the way a temperature changes in the moment before weather arrives. Clara, he said. Don't, she said gently. Not yet. Let it be what it is for a while longer. Another silence. This one was comfortable, the kind that belongs to people who have decided to trust each other without yet knowing the full cost of it. All right, he said. They found the fence damage half a mile further on significant but fixable 3 posts down and a long run of wire that had snapped under the weight of something heavy. They worked it together for 2 hours in the cold trading tools, without needing to ask who needed what next. Falling into the rhythm of shared work, with the naturalness that belongs only to people who are matched in some fundamental way that has nothing to do with similarity and everything to do with fit. When the last post was set and the wire strung, Clara straightened up, pressed her hands to the ache in her lower back, and looked at what they'd done. "Good work," Caleb said. "You keep saying that," she said. "I keep meaning it," he said. She looked at him, this quiet, honest, careful man, who had chosen her without flourish, and was showing her daily in the plain language of actions, rather than declarations, what that choice had meant. And somewhere between the 12th day and the ride home through the cold mountain afternoon, something shifted in Clara Whitmore. Something she had kept locked and practical and defended against exactly this kind of territory. And she thought with equal measures of clarity and terror, "I am going to be in serious trouble here." She said nothing. She rode home, beside Caleb Thornton, and helped put the horses up, and went inside to start dinner, and the mountain held them both in its cold, patient, enormous hands, entirely indifferent to the small and complicated and quietly extraordinary thing that was beginning to happen between them. Victor Blackwell arrived on a Thursday, which was, Clara would later think, exactly the kind of day a man like him would choose. Ordinary enough that no one was on guard. Cold enough that people were distracted by practical discomforts and less likely to pay attention to the quality of a smile. She was in the office with the ledgers when she heard the wagon, and she heard Caleb's voice from the yard change in a way she had learned to read over the past 3 weeks. Not alarm, but the particular flattening of a man who is composing himself before engaging with something he does not trust. She set her pen down and listened. The voice that answered Caleb's greeting was large, and practiced the voice of a man who had spent years making rooms feel smaller than they were, who had learned that warmth deployed strategically was more effective than force. Clara had met men like this before. Her father had done business with 2 of them briefly before understanding his mistake. She stayed where she was. She listened. "Caleb, you look well. Mountain air does something for a man. I've always believed that." A pause, the theatrical kind, designed to suggest spontaneity. "I was up this way checking on the Halford property and thought I'd stop in. I hope that's not an inconvenience." "It's never an inconvenience, Victor," Caleb said in the tone of a man for whom it is in fact an inconvenience. "Good man. Is there somewhere we might talk? I have a proposition I think you'll find worth your time." Clara heard the footsteps cross the porch. She picked up her pen and went back to the ledger because she had found that people revealed themselves most honestly when they believed they were not being observed, and the best way to be unobserved was to appear entirely occupied. The kitchen door opened. She heard Caleb say behind her, "My Miss Whitmore manages the accounts." A fractional pause in his voice on the first word that she filed away for later. "Clara, this is Victor Blackwell. He has property interests in the valley." She turned. Victor Blackwell was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, well-dressed for a man claiming to have been passing through on a casual visit. His face was handsome in the architectural way of faces that have been carefully managed, the smile lines placed correctly, the eyes warm, at exactly the appropriate temperature. He looked at Clara with the particular brand of courtesy that men apply to women they have immediately assessed as peripheral. "Miss Whitmore," he said pleasantly. "I didn't know Caleb had taken on office help." "She's not office help," Caleb said. The correction was quiet, but immediate. Something moved in Blackwell's expression, quickly contained. "Of course, forgive me." To Clara, "A pleasure." "Mr. Blackwell," Clara said. She turned back to the ledger, not rudely, simply with the clear implication that she had work to do, and that his arrival did not constitute a reason to stop doing it. She heard Caleb direct him toward the front room. As they passed through the doorway, she heard Blackwell say quietly, and with the easy assumption of a man who expects to be agreed with, "Interesting choice bringing a woman into the accounts." And she heard Caleb say even more quietly, "Best financial mind on this ranch." She kept her eyes on the columns, but she turned one ear toward the front room and listened with everything she had. She couldn't hear the specifics of the conversation. The walls of the main house were solid, and Blackwell had the sense to keep his voice low once the door was closed. But she heard the duration of it, which was 40 minutes, and she heard the tone of Caleb's voice when he came back through the kitchen afterward, which told her everything the words couldn't. He sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long moment. "Well," she said without looking up, "I wants to buy the north pasture." "The one with the creek access?" "Yes." "What did you tell him?" "That I'd think about it." She set her pen down then and turned to face him fully. "You're not going to sell it?" It was not a question. He looked at her. "No," he said, "I'm not." "Then why didn't you tell him that?" Caleb was quiet in a way that meant he was thinking through something he wasn't sure how to say. "Because Victor Blackwell doesn't take no for an answer the first time you give it. He takes it as the opening of a negotiation. And if I close the negotiation before it starts, he looks for another way." Clara considered this. "You've dealt with him before. 3 years ago, he wanted the East grazing rights. I declined. He spent 4 months trying to find a legal mechanism to compel the sale easement rights water rights, a survey dispute he manufactured from nothing." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "It cost me $600 in lawyers and 2 months of distraction during calving season. And he got what he wanted. He got nothing. But it cost me more than it cost him, and he knew it would." Caleb looked at her. "He came back. That's what I need you to understand. Men like Blackwell, they keep the account open. They don't lose, they just defer." Clara turned this over carefully. "What's different this time about the north pasture specifically?" "The creek," Caleb said. "The water supply from that creek feeds 3 of my best grazing sections. If he controls the source, he can effectively control the range without owning it." "Can he do that legally?" "If he can establish prior usage rights, which he'd have to manufacture since my family has worked that water for 30 years. Then yes. If he buys the parcel outright and reroutes or dams the creek, then the question becomes what the territorial courts would do about it. And the territorial courts have a complicated relationship with men who make significant contributions to certain judges' re-election campaigns." Clara was quiet. Outside, Blackwell's wagon was pulling away from the yard. She heard the sound of it clearly, the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who is not leaving because he's finished, but because he's decided to take his time. "Show me the land records," she said. Caleb looked at her. "For the north pasture, the creek, all of it. Whatever documentation you have on the water usage and the property boundaries." She met his eyes directly. "If he's going to come at this legally, then the defense is legal. And the defense starts with knowing exactly what you have and exactly where the vulnerabilities are before he finds them." A pause. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a man recalibrating a weight he had been carrying alone and discovering it is suddenly lighter than it was. "All right," he said. He stood up. "Give me an hour." The land records told a story, and the story had a hole in it. Clara found it on the second evening of going through the documents, a gap in the recorded water usage dating back 8 years, corresponding to a period when the ranch had been short-staffed following a sickness that had taken 2 of Caleb's longest-standing hands. During that period, the records showed reduced activity in the north section. Not abandonment, the land had been used and the water drawn, but the documentation was sparse, and in the world of territorial property law, sparse documentation was an invitation to creative interpretation. She found Caleb in the barn, working late on equipment maintenance, in the way he always worked late, when something was troubling him productively, methodically, but with a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. "I found something," she said. He set down his tools. She showed him the gap, explained what it meant, watched his face as he understood. "He'll find it," Caleb said. "He may already have found it," she said. "Or someone working for him has. It's the obvious vulnerability. It's the first thing a lawyer would look for." She paused. "But finding a gap isn't the same as exploiting it. To establish prior usage rights, he'd need to show that someone else was using that water during the gap period and that Thornton land was not. Can he do that?" Caleb thought. "He bought the Halford property 2 years ago. The Halfords had a line shack in the North Hills seasonal, never more than that. But if he's had someone up there establishing a presence, then he's been planning this for at least 2 years," Clara said. The barn was quiet, except for the horses moving in their stalls, and the wind outside doing its patient work on the eaves. "I was never just passing through today," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. He was working through the shape of it. "No," Clara said. "Today was reconnaissance. He came to see what you have on the ranch now, who's here, what's changed, whether you're stronger or weaker than the last time he moved against you." She met his eyes. "And he saw me." Caleb's expression shifted. "You think he'll try to use you somehow?" "I think he assessed me as peripheral and dismissed me," Clara said, "which is a mistake people make about me with some regularity." She kept her voice even factual. "A man like Blackwell constructs his pressure based on what he understands of his target. He understands you as a solitary man who runs a difficult operation alone, and whose vulnerabilities come from the isolation of that, from having no one who will stand beside him in a prolonged fight. He doesn't yet understand that that's changed." Caleb looked at her for a long moment in the lantern light. "Has it?" he asked, quietly. Not testing her, asking genuinely, with the careful honesty of a man who doesn't pretend to know things he isn't sure of. And Clara, who had spent 26 years managing other people's comfort, and had come to this mountain to stop, found herself giving the only answer that was true. "Yes," she said. "It has." The town of Ridgeback Crossing was 6 miles from the ranch, small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and large enough to have a courthouse, a land office, a bank, and a saloon that functioned as the informal center of regional commerce and gossip. Clara had been to town twice since arriving at the ranch, once for supplies with Pete, once with Caleb to introduce her to the man who ran the general store, a transaction so low-key and practical that it had felt more like a business introduction than a social one. The third time she went alone. She told Caleb she needed to visit the land office. She told Pete to expect her back by mid-afternoon. She saddled her horse herself, which she had been doing since day 3, and she rode the 6 miles in the cold November morning with the Territorial Land Registry document folded in her coat pocket and a list of questions in her head that she had been building for 4 days. The land office was managed by a man named Henderson, who was 60 years old, had worked that office for 22 of them, and who looked at Clara when she walked in with the practiced assessment of a man who has learned not to underestimate people who look like they don't belong in an office like his. "I'm inquiring on behalf of the Thornton Ranch," Clara said without preamble. "I need to understand the process for formally documenting historical water usage rights under territorial law, and I need to know what constitutes sufficient evidence of continuous use." Henderson studied her for a moment. "You're the woman Caleb Thornton brought up to the ranch," he said. "I manage the ranch accounts," she said. "And at the moment, I'm managing a potential legal vulnerability. Can you help me, or would you prefer I find someone who can?" Henderson, who had clearly encountered enough people who were performing competence to recognize the real variety when he met it, pulled out a chair. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Let me show you what we have." What they had was both better and worse than she'd expected. Better, the Thornton family's original land patent was unimpeachable, 31 years of continuous documented ownership, and Henderson himself remembered the elder Thornton's applications, because he'd been a young clerk when they were filed. Worse, the water usage gap she'd found in the ranch records was mirrored to her alarm in the territorial water registration documents. 8 years ago, for a period of 14 months, there was no formal record of the Thornton Ranch drawing water rights from the North Creek. "Is this unusual?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "For a big operation, it's unusual," Henderson said. He was looking at the record with an expression that told her he was thinking about something he wasn't yet ready to say. For a ranch that had a bad couple of years lost men reduced operations, it's less unusual than you'd think. But it's irregular enough that someone looking to challenge the rights would find it. "Has anyone been in asking about this record recently?" Clara asked. Henderson looked at her. The question had landed where she intended it to. "That's not generally information I share," he said. "I understand," she said. "I'm asking because I believe an attempt is being made to manufacture a prior usage claim on that water source, and if someone with an interest in that outcome has already been examining these records, I need to know the shape of what I'm dealing with." Henderson was quiet for a long moment. He was a man she could see who had his own opinions about the forces that moved through this valley and their respective merits. "A lawyer came in," he said finally. "3 weeks ago. From Helena, not local. Asked to see the Thornton North Section records and the associated water registrations." He paused. He was polite about it. Said he was doing research for a property acquisition client. Clara kept her face composed. "Did he copy anything?" "He made notes. 3 weeks ago, before Blackwell's visit, before Caleb had any indication that something was moving against him." "Mr. Henderson," Clara said carefully, "what would it take to formally reinstate and document the continuous water usage for the Thornton North Creek? Not retroactively going forward with a statement of historical use." Henderson looked at her with something that was close to admiration. "You'd need affidavits from people who can attest to observing the usage during the gap period. Neighbors, traders, anyone who had regular contact with the North Section during those 14 months. People like yourself," she said, "who may have had dealings with the Thornton Ranch during that period." Henderson tapped his fingers on the counter once. "I did ride out that way summer of '76, he said slowly. "Caleb's father asked me to witness a boundary survey. The creek was running and in use. I saw it myself. Would you be willing to put that in a sworn statement?" Henderson looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man deciding which side of a thing he wants to be on. "Bring me the paperwork," he said. "I'll sign what I can truthfully sign." Clara stood. "Thank you." "Miss Whitmore." She paused. "Blackwell's been buying up water-adjacent land in this valley for 3 years. You're not the first person to come in here worried about his intentions." He met her eyes. "But you might be the first person who came in with a plan instead of a complaint." She rode back to the ranch in the cold afternoon, with her mind working faster than the horse. She told Caleb everything that evening, laid out in the precise sequential order she had learned. He preferred facts. First implications, second proposed responses, third. He listened without interrupting, which she had also learned was his way. He did not perform concern or indignation. He sat with what she was telling him and absorbed it at the pace it required. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's been planning this for 3 years, he said. "At minimum. And the lawyer in Henderson's office 3 weeks ago was there before Blackwell came to see you," she said. "The visit wasn't reconnaissance, or not only that. By the time he sat in your front room, he already knew about the gap in the records. He came to see whether you knew." Caleb's jaw tightened. "And he saw that I didn't." "He saw that you hadn't found it yet," Clara said. "There's a difference." She paused. "He didn't see me going through those records at the kitchen table. He saw a woman he wrote off as peripheral." Something moved in Caleb's eyes. And now we have Henderson willing to give a sworn affidavit, a clear record of the family patent going back 31 years, and a 3-week head start on knowing what Blackwell knows. She folded her hands on the table. "What we need now is a lawyer of our own. Someone good. Someone who isn't connected to the valley political machinery." "That means someone expensive," Caleb said. "Yes." Howe was quiet. She knew from the accounts she'd been managing that the ranch was financially solid, but not extravagant. Caleb ran it lean by choice, and by the philosophy of a man who had seen what debt did to operations that ran too close to the edge. "I can look at the accounts," she began. "It's not a question of the accounts," he said. He looked at her directly. "It's a question of whether I'm willing to go to war with Victor Blackwell for the second time in 3 years, knowing that even if I win, the cost is significant." "And if you don't," she said, "if you let this proceed without a fight, he gets the north pasture, he gets the creek access." Caleb was steady, but she could hear the weight of it. "And then the east section loses reliable water. Then the grazing patterns change. Then the productivity drops. Then in 3 years, maybe 4, this ranch is no longer what it is." "Then the answer to your question," Clara said quietly, "is yes. You're willing to go to war. Because the alternative isn't peace, it's losing slowly instead of fighting." He looked at her across the kitchen table. This man who had carried this ranch and this mountain alone for 11 years, who had sent a letter to a town 3 valleys away, because he had been looking for someone who would tell him the truth, even when the truth was hard. "Yes," he said. "I'm willing." "Good," she said. "Then here's what we do." She had the outline of the legal strategy on paper by midnight. Caleb found her at the kitchen table at 11:30, still working, and set a cup of coffee beside her without comment, and then sat across from her and read through what she'd written in silence. When he finished, he set the papers down. "You know," he said, "when I sent that letter to your family, I had been told you were practically intelligent. I thought that meant you were sensible and capable of managing a household without drama." Clara looked up. "And I did not think it meant you could out-strategize a man who has been running land schemes in this territory for 20 years. He's clever," she said, "but he's been operating in an environment where the people opposing him either don't see what he's doing until it's too late, or see it and don't have the tools to fight back. He hasn't encountered someone who sees it early and knows what tools to use." "Where did you learn this?" he asked, not skeptically, genuinely. "The legal strategy, the land records, how to read what Henderson was and wasn't saying." "My father's business trouble," she said. "When I was 17, we nearly lost the house. He didn't understand what was happening. A contractor had structured a debt arrangement in a way that looked straightforward and was anything but. I was the one who went through the documents. I was the one who found the flaw in the contractor's claim." She paused. "My father hired a lawyer based on what I told him. We won. And he credited you for it." The question hung in the air. "He thanked the lawyer," Clara said without bitterness, just factually, just honestly. The way people thank the person they can see and forget to thank the person they overlooked. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "I won't do that," he said. She looked at him. The lamp was low, and the kitchen was cold at its edges and warm at its center where the stove still held heat, and Caleb Thornton was looking at her with the straightforward intensity of a man who has decided to say something true and is going to say it without ornamentation. "Whatever comes of this, the legal fight, Blackwell, all of it, you won't be the person I forget to thank. You won't be the person I overlook." He held her gaze. "I need you to understand that." Clara understood it. She understood it in the place where she kept the things that mattered. "I understand," she said. "Good." He stood, collected both cups. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we send a telegraph to Helena for a lawyer." He was halfway to the sink when she said, "Caleb." He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for this, for seeing it." He didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was one she hadn't seen before, open in a way that was slightly raw. The expression of a man who has allowed himself just for a moment to stop managing his own face. Thank you, he said, "for not making me do it alone." The second letter from her mother arrived 4 days later, and this one was shorter, and its brevity was more alarming than the previous letter's length. Clara, I have heard from Josephine that a Victor Blackwell, a prominent businessman in the Mountain Valley region, has been making inquiries in Millhaven about the Thornton Ranch. He spoke with your father at the county bank last week. He was very charming, apparently, and asked a great many questions about you, specifically your character, your temperament, your history with the family. Your father, not understanding the import, answered honestly, "I thought you should know." Clara read the letter standing at the gatepost where Pete had handed it to her, and then she read it again, and the cold around her did not account for all the chill she felt. Blackwell had gone to Millhaven, had spoken to her father, had asked about her specifically. He knew she was involved. He knew she was a variable he hadn't accounted for, and he had gone not to Caleb's business contacts, not to his competitors, but to her family, the people most likely to provide information freely and without understanding why they were being asked. Her father, not understanding the import, answered honestly. She could see it exactly. Her father, a decent man with a blind spot, the size of a continent where Clara was concerned, sitting across from a charming stranger in the county bank and answering questions about his difficult, too opinionated, too capable daughter with the frank and slightly relieved openness of a man who had never quite known what to do with her and found it unexpectedly comfortable to explain her to someone else. She walked to the barn. She found Caleb. "He knows," she said, "about me, about what I'm doing." She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched his face. When he looked up, There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, but the particular cold clarity of a man who has been protecting something and has just understood that the threat is closer than he thought. "He's going to come at you," Caleb said. "He's going to try to discredit me," she said. "Everything my father told him, and my father told him everything, because my father didn't know any better. Every instance of my being called difficult. Every failed social expectation. Every time I was called too opinionated, or too stubborn, or too much. Blackwell is going to use that to argue that I'm an unstable influence whose involvement in your affairs is evidence of your poor judgment." "He can argue whatever he wants," Caleb said. "In this territory in 1884 with certain judges, the argument that a woman has corrupted a man's business sense is not a ridiculous one," Clara said. Her voice was steady. She had looked at this clearly, and she was not going to pretend she hadn't. "He's not attacking the ranch. He's attacking you through me." The barn was very quiet. Then, Caleb Thornton said something that Clara would carry with her for the rest of her life, said it in the same plain, unhurried voice he used for everything that was true. "Then let him try," he said. "Because the only thing he's proven is that he's afraid of what you know. And a man who goes to your father's bank to find ammunition against you has already lost the argument." He folded the letter and handed it back to her. "Finish the legal brief," he said. "I'll send the telegraph to Helena today. And Clara." She met his eyes. "You are not a vulnerability on this ranch. Don't let him make you feel like one, not for a single minute." She held the letter in her hand in the cold barn with the horses breathing around her, and she thought about a man who assessed women as peripheral and found the ones who weren't to be problems to be managed. And she thought about what it meant that he had come for her specifically, and she thought, all right then. Come. Because Clara Whitmore, who had spent 26 years being told she was too much, had finally found a place where too much was exactly enough, and she was not going to let anyone take it from her. Not without a fight they would remember. The lawyer from Helena arrived on a Monday morning, and his name was James Alcott, and he was not what Clara had expected. She had expected someone like the lawyers her father had dealt with. Careful men. Conservative men. Men who wore their authority like a second coat and spoke in the measured cadences of people who charged by the word. James Alcott was 38 years old, lean as a fence post with quick eyes and the particular restless energy of a man whose mind worked faster than most conversations allowed for. He shook Caleb's hand, shook Clara's hand, with exactly the same firmness, sat down at the kitchen table and said, "Show me everything you have, all of it. Don't edit for what you think matters, let me decide what matters." Clara had it organized and waiting. She had spent the previous 4 days building the file the way she built the accounts methodically, chronologically with annotations where context was needed and nothing where it wasn't. She set it in front of Alcott and watched him read. He read fast and without comment for 20 minutes. Then he looked up at Clara specifically. "The Henderson affidavit, did you draft the questions?" "I outlined the relevant territory," she said. Henderson drafted his own statement. "And the Halford property records, how did you get these?" "The land office keeps purchase records as public document. I requested a copy of the registered sale." Alcott looked at Caleb. "Did you find her, or did she find you?" "I found her," Caleb said. "Though I'll admit I didn't know exactly what I was finding." Alcott looked back at the file. "What you have here," he said, "is a defensive case. It's solid the Henderson affidavit fills the gap. The family patent documentation is unimpeachable, and the Halford purchase records establish a timeline that is very uncomfortable for Blackwell if he tries to claim recent prior usage." He paused. "But a defensive case only wins if Blackwell stays on offense. If he decides to shift to find a different mechanism, a different legal angle, you're always reacting." "What's the alternative?" Clara asked. "The alternative is finding something on Blackwell that makes going on offense more trouble than it's worth." Alcott leaned back. "In my experience, men who operate the way he operates, who manufacture legal pressure, who use the courts as tools for acquisition, they are not careful about doing it cleanly. They leave traces, not always obvious ones, but traces." He looked between them. Is there anyone in this valley who Blackwell has successfully moved against, someone who lost land or rights to him, and might have documentation of how it happened? Clara and Caleb looked at each other. The Morrison family, Caleb said slowly. They had a grazing lease on the South Hills, lost it 2 years ago. The official story was financial trouble, but Ed Morrison told me once that he felt the trouble was assisted. Where is Morrison now? 3 miles down the valley. Alcott closed the file. Then that's where I'm going this afternoon, he said. And in the meantime, he looked at Clara. Keep working the financial records, not just the ranch accounts. If Blackwell has been doing what I think he's been doing, the pattern will show up in the money. It always shows up in the money. After Alcott had ridden out, Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway with the particular expression of a man who has been listening from the right distance and has formed an opinion. I like him, Pete said. You like anyone who gets to the point, Clara said. That's accurate, Pete agreed and poured himself coffee. The next 4 days were the most concentrated work of Clara's life. She pulled every financial record the ranch had, not just the accounts she'd been managing, but the older ledgers, the supply invoices, the records of transactions with neighboring ranches, and with the town merchants, anything that touched the economic life of the region. She was looking for the pattern Alcott had described, the fingerprint of how Blackwell moved not in legal filings, but in money, because money told the truth that documents obscured. She found it on the 3rd day, and it was elegant and cold, and once she could see it obvious. Blackwell operated through the valley's primary supply merchant, a man named Griggs, who ran the largest general store and supply operation in Ridgeback Crossing. Griggs extended credit to ranchers in the valley, which was ordinary and necessary, and how commerce worked in a territory where cash was intermittent and seasonal. What was not ordinary was the pattern she could see in the records. Certain ranches at certain predictable moments had their credit terms altered, not dramatically, not in ways that would be immediately alarming, but enough to create cash pressure at exactly the seasons when that pressure was most damaging. Calving season. Harvest. The early weeks of winter, when supply costs peaked and income was still weeks away. And then, in the months following each credit squeeze, land changed hands. Water rights were sold under pressure. Grazing leases were relinquished, and the buyer through intermediaries that were not immediately obvious but became so when you traced the money back. 3 steps was always Victor Blackwell. Clara sat with this for an hour before she said anything to anyone. She was looking at proof of something that went well beyond a property dispute over the north pasture. She was looking at what appeared to be a systematic years-long scheme to acquire water-adjacent land throughout the valley by manufacturing financial pressure on its owners. She was looking at something that, if she was reading it correctly, had affected not just the Morrison family, but at least 4 other ranching operations in the region. She was also looking at something that, if she brought it forward, would make Victor Blackwell very dangerous, very quickly. She went to find Caleb. She told him in the barn because she had learned that Caleb processed serious things better in working spaces than in sitting rooms, that his mind and his body needed to be in the same register, and in the barn, with his hands occupied, and the familiar sounds of the horses around him, he could hear hard things and hold them without the adrenaline that hit him in open spaces. She laid it out exactly as she'd laid it out for herself. The supply merchant, the credit terms, the timing, the pattern of acquisition. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He's been doing this for years, Caleb said. At least 6 from the records I can trace. The Morrison family didn't lose their lease because of financial trouble. They lost it because their credit was squeezed at exactly the wrong moment, in exactly the wrong season, and they didn't have the reserves to absorb it. Clara kept her voice level. Neither did the Hargrove family in '78, or the Dalton brothers in '81. They all sold or surrendered rights in the 6 months following a credit disruption that the records suggest was not accidental. Caleb set down the tool in his hand, deliberately and carefully, the way he did things when he was controlling something internal. He was going to do the same to us, he said. The North Pasture offer was step 1, Clara said. If you'd sold or been pressured to sell the creek access, would have given him leverage over the east section. When the east section became difficult to sustain, he'd have been there with another offer. Reasonable, patient, like a man doing you a favor. How do we prove it? Alcott, she said. And the supply records from Griggs' operation, those are commercial records and a lawyer can subpoena them if there's cause. What I have is enough to establish cause. She paused. But Caleb, when we bring this, it stops being a property dispute about one creek. It becomes a formal allegation against a man who has been operating in this territory for 20 years, and who has, I suspect, significant political protection. The response is not going to be small. He looked at her steadily. You're telling me this gets bigger before it gets resolved? Yes. And you're asking me whether I want to pull back? I'm giving you the information, she said. The decision is yours. Caleb was quiet for the moment. Then he looked at her with the direct, unornamented clarity that was the most essentially Caleb thing about him. Ed Morrison lost that lease 2 years ago, he said. He had 3 boys working that land. He had to sell the family house when the lease went. His wife's health broke the winter after. He paused. The Dalton brothers moved to Oregon. The older one had worked his section for 14 years. Another pause. If we have what you're describing, and we pull back, we're choosing our comfort over their truth. And I won't do that. Clara looked at him across the barn in the cold gray light, and felt something large and irreversible settle somewhere in the center of her chest. All right, she said. Then we don't pull back. Alcott came back from the Morrison property with 3 handwritten pages of notes and an expression that told Clara he had found what he'd gone looking for. Ed Morrison, it turned out, had kept everything. Not because he'd had a legal strategy, he'd had no such thing, but because he was the kind of man who couldn't bring himself to throw away paper that represented something that had been done to him even when keeping it was only painful and seemingly pointless. He had credit correspondence. He had invoices with unusual terms. He had a letter from Griggs explaining a policy change in language that was apologetic and carefully vague. And he had a copy of the deed transfer for the grazing lease, signed under duress, in a notary's office in Ridgeback Crossing, with a witness whose name, when Alcott cross-referenced it against his own files from Helena, appeared in 2 other distressed property transactions in adjacent territories over the previous decade. The witness is a professional, Alcott said at the kitchen table that evening. He travels. He shows up when signatures are needed and disappears after. He's done this at least 7 times that I can find in territorial records. He looked at Clara's financial analysis. Combined with what you've found, the credit timing, the acquisition pattern, this is no longer a property dispute. This is fraud. Systematic, premeditated fraud. What does that mean legally? Caleb asked. It means we don't file in the territorial property court, Alcott said. We go to the federal land office. This is a federal matter, the fraudulent manipulation of land rights in a federal territory. The federal examiner's jurisdiction supersedes the territorial judges, most of whom I would speculate have been very comfortable not looking too closely at how certain property transfers happen in this valley. Clara heard the implication clearly. Blackwell has territory-level protection, she said, but not federal level. Not if the federal office receives a properly documented complaint with supporting evidence, Alcott said. He looked at both of them. This is the part where I have to tell you that filing this complaint will be the most dangerous thing you do. Blackwell will know within days, probably hours. His response will be fast, and it will be targeted. He cannot afford for this to go forward. What will he do? Clara asked. He'll attack the credibility of the evidence and the credibility of the people providing it, Alcott said. He'll start with you. He was looking at Clara. I need you to be prepared for that. He has information about your family history, your personal reputation in your hometown. He will use it. Let him, Clara said. Alcott looked at her for a moment. You understand what that means. He will say things about you publicly in court, if it comes to that in the town beforehand, to anyone whose opinion matters to this proceeding. He will say that I'm difficult, Clara said, that I'm opinionated and stubborn, and that no one in my own family could manage me. He'll say that a woman like me has no business in a legal proceeding, and that my involvement is evidence of Caleb's poor judgment, and that nothing I've found should be trusted because I am fundamentally not to be trusted. She met Alcott's eyes. And then I will sit down in front of whoever is conducting that proceeding, and I will walk through every document and every figure in the precise sequential order I have organized them, and I will answer every question with complete accuracy, and we will let the evidence speak for itself." Alcott was quiet for a beat. Then he said to Caleb, "You said you found her." "I did," Caleb said. "Lucky man," said Alcott, and opened his case file. The complaint was filed on a Thursday, and by Friday evening, Ridgeback Crossing knew. Clara learned this from Pete, who had gone to town for supplies and come back with the supplies and a full accounting of what the town was saying, which was everything in the way of small communities that have been given a genuinely remarkable piece of information and are processing it in real time across every available venue simultaneously. "Blackwell's been to see 3 people on the town council," Pete said at the kitchen table, "telling them Caleb's been manipulated by a woman from out of the valley who has, and I'm using his words here, an unstable disposition and a personal grudge against legitimate business interests." "Unstable disposition," Clara repeated. His words. Caleb, sitting across from her, said nothing. His jaw was set. He also told the Ridgeback Crossing Gazette, Pete continued with the particular relish of a man who dislikes wasting words, but recognizes when words are doing important work, that Miss Clara Whitmore was removed from her family home in Millhaven, due to, and again, his words' persistent difficulties in maintaining appropriate conduct. The kitchen was very quiet. "My family didn't remove me," Clara said. "I left, with a choice offered to me by a man I respected." "I know that," Pete said. "Most people who know you know that. The people who don't know you yet are the problem." Clara looked at Caleb. I was looking at her with an expression she recognized now, the one that was not composure exactly, but something beyond composure, something that had already done the calculus of the situation and arrived at certainty. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to go to town," she said. He looked at her. "Not to argue," she said. "Not to defend myself to people who have already decided. I want to go to Ed Morrison, and to whatever other families Blackwell moved against, and I want to sit down with them, and I want them to know that someone is fighting this, that it's not just us." She paused. "Because Blackwell's real protection isn't the territorial judges. It's the silence of the people he's hurt. If they stay silent because they believe nothing can change, he wins even if we win. But if they speak, if the Morrisons and the Hargroves and every family that lost something to this man stand behind the complaint at the federal hearing, the examiner can't ignore a pattern of victims," Alcott said from the doorway, where he had apparently been listening for the last 60 seconds without announcing himself. "I was going to suggest exactly that tomorrow. Miss Whitmore got there first." "I've noticed she does that," Caleb said, and the way he said it was quiet and warm and entirely without the performance of a compliment. Just a fact, stated by a man who had been watching this woman for 6 weeks and had stopped being surprised by her and started being grateful. They went together. Clara had not asked Caleb to come. She had planned to go with Pete, who was known in the valley in ways she was not, and whose presence would open doors faster than hers. But Caleb had appeared at the horses that morning, as she was saddling up in his good coat, and said nothing beyond, "I'll ride with you." She had not argued. The Morrison property was the first stop, and Ed Morrison, a weathered, quiet man of 60, who looked like someone who had been carrying weight for too long and had simply adjusted his posture to accommodate it, opened his door and saw Caleb Thornton and Clara Whitmore standing on his porch and said nothing for a moment. Then he stepped back and said, "Come in." His wife Margaret was in the kitchen. She looked at Clara with the careful eyes of a woman who has learned to assess new people quickly and at some cost. Clara sat across from her and didn't use any of the careful language she had prepared. She told her plainly and directly what they had found, what they had filed, and what was happening now. Margaret Morrison said nothing for a long moment after Clara finished. Then she said, "We kept the papers." "I know," Clara said. "Mr. Alcott spoke with your husband." "I kept them because I couldn't make myself believe that nobody would ever care," Margaret said. Her voice was steady in the particular way of women who have held themselves steady past the point where steadiness should have been possible. "Ed told me I was holding on to something that would only keep hurting us, but I couldn't." "You were right to keep them," Clara said. "They matter. They matter very much." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need from us?" "Testimony," Clara said. "At the federal hearing. Yours and Ed's if you're willing. Not just the documents, your voices. Because documents can be disputed, but a man and a woman sitting in front of a federal examiner and describing exactly what was done to them and exactly how, and then 10 more people behind them with the same story." She paused. "That is harder to dispute." Margaret Morrison reached across the kitchen table and put her hand over Clara's. "Tell us where to be," she said. By the end of that week, they had heard from 4 families. By the end of the second week, they had 7. Each visit was different in its details and the same in its essential shape. People who had experienced something they could not prove and had therefore carried it in silence, who found when someone arrived and said, "We believe you, and here is why," that they had been waiting for exactly that. The dam did not break slowly. It broke all at once. Alcott worked 18-hour days preparing the submissions. Clara organized the testimony into the same clean sequential structure she had applied to everything, chronological, cross-referenced with each family's experience, mapped against the pattern she had established in the financial records, so that the examiner would not have to do the work of connecting the dots, but would simply have to look at what was already connected. Caleb was on the road, more than he was on the ranch, riding between properties, lending his name and his presence to a process that needed his credibility as much as it needed the documents. He was known in this valley in the way that quiet, honest men who have been somewhere a long time and never made enemies. They didn't have to make are known, not flashily, not publicly, but with the bedrock reliability that people return to when things get serious. Pete ran the ranch while they were gone and said very little about it and did it perfectly. Tom, Carl, and Ringo, the 3 younger hands, found out what was happening through the valley's efficient informal information network and appeared one evening in the kitchen to announce with the slightly stilted dignity of young men doing something formal for the first time that they would do whatever was needed. "What you're doing matters," Tom said to Clara specifically. The young man who 3 weeks ago had been cautiously polite and was now looking at her with the directness of someone who has revised an opinion and wants it known. "What you found and what you're doing about it, it matters to people who needed someone to do it." Clara looked at him. "The evidence mattered," she said. "The people who kept their papers when they had no reason to believe it would help, they matter." "You matter," Tom said with the bluntness of 22. "Don't do that thing where you give the credit to the documents." Pete from the stove made the sound that was almost a laugh. Caleb from the door said nothing. But he looked at Clara with the expression she had come to know, the open, unguarded one he stopped managing for, and it said what he did not say aloud, which was the same thing Tom had said, and more. Blackwell made his move on a Tuesday, 2 weeks before the federal hearing was scheduled. Clara was alone in the office when she heard the wagon and recognized the pace of it, the unhurried, deliberate pace she had marked on his first visit. She did not go to the window. She stayed where she was and waited. Caleb intercepted him in the yard. She heard the voices Caleb's flat and controlled Blackwell's larger, and practiced performing warmth over something that was not warmth at all. Then she heard Blackwell say clearly enough to reach the office window, "I'd like to speak with Miss Whitmore. Directly, if you don't mind." A pause. Caleb's voice. "Clara." Not Miss Whitmore. Not a question. Just her name said in the tone of a man who trusts the person he's calling. She came to the door. Blackwell looked at her with the full attention he had withheld on his first visit. The real attention, the kind that acknowledges a person as an actual force to be reckoned with. It was not a compliment. It was a recalibration. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I was hoping we might speak privately." "We can speak here," she said. "Whatever you have to say to me can be said in front of Caleb." Something moved in his expression. "As you like. I want to be direct with you because I believe you're a direct woman." He arranged his voice into something that was meant to sound reasonable. "What you think you found in those financial records, I understand why it looks the way it looks. But there are explanations for the patterns you've identified that are considerably less dramatic than the picture you've been painting for Mr. Alcott." "I'd be interested to hear them," Clara said. "The credit adjustments you've attributed to me were Griggs's operational decisions made independently. I had no involvement in the terms he set for individual ranchers. My acquisition of property in this valley has been entirely legitimate. I have bought land from people who wanted to sell at prices they agreed to." He paused. "You have constructed a story, Miss Whitmore, that is emotionally compelling and legally very thin. And the people you've convinced to give testimony, they are grieving people who needed someone to blame, and you have given them a story that satisfies that need." Clara had listened to all of this without interrupting. "Mr. Blackwell," she said when he finished, "I didn't construct a story. I read records, credit terms, dates, land transfers, acquisition patterns, wire correspondence between Griggs and your intermediaries, which Mr. Alcott has now subpoenaed, by the way, and which I expect you know about, which is why you're here." She kept her voice entirely level. "You didn't come here to correct my interpretation of the evidence. You came here to ask me to stop." The performance of reasonableness dropped just slightly. Just for a moment. Long enough for her to see what was underneath it. "You are making a very serious mistake," he said, quietly, precisely. "I've been told that before," Clara said, "by people who turned out to be wrong. You are not in your home valley, Miss Whitmore. You are not among people who will. She's among people who will stand behind her." Caleb's voice from beside her was not loud. It did not need to be. "Every person on this ranch, every family that's talked to Alcott, everyone in this valley who has been waiting for someone to say out loud what's been done to them." He looked at Blackwell with the particular steady directness of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has stopped doing that. "You came here to frighten her. She's not frightened, and neither am I." Victor Blackwell looked at them both, at this man and this woman standing together on the porch of a mountain ranch in the November cold, and in his expression behind all the practiced machinery of his authority, Clara saw something she recognized. He had not expected this. He had expected to find what he'd found in every other encounter in this valley, someone standing alone carrying too much with no one beside them. He had found the wrong ranch. "Good day," he said, and turned back to his wagon. They watched him go. When the sound of the wagon had faded entirely, Caleb turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. They were standing closer than usual. The porch was small, and the moment had pulled them together without either of them noticing the physical fact of it until now. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, and she was finished performing emotions she didn't feel and hiding ones she did. "I'm better than all right. I'm angry, and I think clearly when I'm angry." Caleb looked at her for a long moment with the open, unguarded expression she had stopped trying to interpret and had started simply receiving. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said softly. "I need to say it," he said. "Because I've been not saying it for 6 weeks because I didn't want to push anything before it was ready, and I think—" He stopped, steadied himself with the same deliberateness he used for everything that mattered. "I think you should know that when I wrote that letter to your family, I was looking for a capable partner for a difficult life. What I found was—" He paused. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known. And this ranch, this fight, this life, none of it looks the same as it did before you came. Not any of it." The November wind moved between them. Clara Whitmore, who had spent 26 years being told she was too much, stood on this mountain porch beside this careful, honest, extraordinary man, and for the first time in her life felt exactly the right size. "I came to this mountain," she said, "because I had nowhere else worth going, and I stayed because—" She met his eyes directly the way she did everything. "Because this is the first place I have ever been where being exactly who I am is not a problem to be managed. And you are the first person who ever treated my mind as an asset instead of an inconvenience." She paused. "I am in love with you, Caleb Thornton. I have been for some time. And I thought you should know that before the hearing, in case everything goes wrong and I never get another useful opportunity." He looked at her for one long, still completely honest moment. Then he reached up and tucked a strand of wind-blown hair back from her face, with the same careful, deliberate hands he used for everything important, and said, "Nothing's going to go wrong." "You don't know that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I know you, and I've stopped betting against you." And he kissed her, not with drama, not with performance, but with the plain, unhurried certainty of a man who has known what he wanted for a long time and has finally said so. On the porch of a mountain ranch in the November cold, with 7 families' worth of testimony in the office, and a federal hearing 2 weeks away, and Victor Blackwell's wagon disappearing down the mountain road. Clara Whitmore kissed him back with everything she had, which was, it turned out, considerable. Behind them, from somewhere near the barn, Pete Garvey made a sound that was definitively, and for the first time, an actual laugh. The 2 weeks before the federal hearing were the longest of Clara's life, and also in a way she could not have predicted and would not have chosen the most clarifying. She woke every morning at 4 and was at the table by 4:15 with the evidence file and a cup of coffee, and the particular focused quiet of a person who understands that the difference between winning and losing is almost always preparation, not brilliance, not luck, but the patient, unglamorous work of knowing your material better than anyone in the room. Caleb brought her coffee at 6 without being asked. Pete covered her morning chores without being asked. Tom and Carl, when they noticed she had been inside for 3 days straight, began leaving food on the office table. Biscuits, dried meat, once a full plate of supper with a note in Tom's careful handwriting that said, simply, "Eat this, please." She ate it. She was not too proud for kindness. She had learned on this mountain that accepting help from people who offered it freely was not weakness. It was the acknowledgement that nobody, not even her, did anything alone. Alcott came and went from the ranch in the concentrated way of a man in the middle of the most significant case of his professional career. And in his quieter moments, he told Clara things about the federal land system and territorial legal procedure that she filed away with the same meticulous attention she gave the accounts because she believed correctly. As it turned out, that understanding the arena was as important as understanding the evidence. The examiner they're sending, Alcott told her on the Tuesday before the hearing, is a man named Clifford Marsh. He's from Washington. He has no prior relationship with this territory, which is why the federal office chose him. He's thorough, he's impatient with wasted time, and he will not be impressed by credentials or reputation. He will be impressed by evidence and by the quality of the testimony. What should I know about how he conducts a hearing? Clara asked. He'll let everyone speak. He won't interrupt unnecessarily. But he watches faces as much as he listens to words. He's looking for the person who knows what they're talking about versus the person who is reciting what they've been coached to say. Alcott paused. Don't be coached. When he asks you something, answer what he asked. If you don't know something, say so. The fastest way to lose his confidence is to overreach. I don't overreach, Clara said. Alcott looked at her. No, he said. I've noticed that about you. It's unusual. It was trained into me by a lifetime of being dismissed the moment I went one word beyond what I could prove, she said. Useful preparation, as it turns out. Alcott smiled for the first time since she'd known him. I suppose it was. The night before the hearing, Clara could not sleep. She lay in the north bedroom, her bedroom now, the one with the lock, whose key she still kept on the dresser, out of habit rather than necessity, and listened to the mountain doing what it always did, which was exist with enormous indifference to the small human dramas happening on its slopes, and she thought about every version of tomorrow that could occur. She heard the floorboard outside her door at some point past midnight, the particular creak of the third board from the top of the stairs, which she had learned was Caleb's step identifiable from Pete's heavier tread, and the nearly silent movement of any of the younger hands. She heard him stop. A light knock. Too quiet. I'm awake, she said. The door opened. She had left it unlocked, which they both understood without discussing it as a marker of where things had arrived between them, and Caleb came in and sat on the chair near the window. Not on the bed, maintaining the careful, physical propriety of a man who understood the difference between what was between them and what was formally settled. They sat in the dark for a moment. Can't sleep, he said. It wasn't a question. I keep running the testimony sequence, she said, checking for gaps. Are there any? No, but I keep checking anyway. He was quiet. Then, I used to do that before bad winters. Run through the preparation in my head. Check the woodpile count, the hay stores, the state of the roof. Look for what I'd missed. Did you always find something? Sometimes. Sometimes I'd checked it right the first time, And the second check was just my nerves pretending to be useful. He paused. I think this might be your nerves pretending to be useful. Clara considered this. Probably, she said. I'm not accustomed to this much being outside my control. I can control the evidence. I can't control Marsh or Blackwell's lawyers, or what the witnesses say under pressure. Ed Morrison isn't going to break under pressure, Caleb said. I've known that man 20 years. He's been carrying this for 2 years already. He's been waiting for this room. And the others? Same. His voice was certain, not performing certainty, actually holding it. You spent 2 weeks sitting at their kitchen tables and letting them know someone believed them. You didn't do that by accident, and it didn't go unnoticed. Those people are going to walk into that hearing because of you, Clara. They're not going to fall apart in front of you. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not afraid of losing the hearing, she said then, and it came out more honest than she'd intended, the real thing under the preparation and the strategy and the competence. I'm afraid of what it means if we lose. Not for the ranch, for the families who trusted us, who kept their papers for years and handed them over because we told them it would matter. Caleb moved from the chair and sat on the edge of the bed, the first time he had done so, and took her hand with the same directness he brought to everything important. Then we don't lose, he said. Caleb, I know I can't promise that, he said, but I can tell you that you have done everything a person can do. The evidence is real. The witnesses are real. Marsh is a federal examiner, not a territorial judge, with a social relationship with Victor Blackwell. Whatever happens tomorrow. He held her hand steadily. You have already changed something. People who were silent are speaking. That doesn't go back to what it was, win or lose. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that in the dark for a long time, not talking, not needing to, just two people who had built something real together, sitting on the edge of the night before everything would be tested, and neither of them pretending it wasn't hard, and neither of them letting go. Go to sleep, he said eventually. You first, she said. He almost laughed. Stubborn. Consistently, she agreed. He squeezed her hand once, stood up, and went back to the door. In the doorway he paused. Clara. She looked at him across the dark room. Whatever tomorrow brings you are the best thing that has ever happened to this ranch, and to me. He said it plainly, the way he said everything true. I need you to know that before we walk into that room. She held at this man, this moment, this mountain that had taken her in and asked nothing of her but exactly what she was. I know, she said. Now go sleep. I went. She heard the third stair creak, and then his door, and then the silence of the house holding everyone inside it. She closed her eyes. She slept. The federal hearing was held in the Ridgeback Crossing Courthouse, and it was standing room by 8 in the morning. Clara had not expected that. She had thought of this as a legal proceeding, formal, contained, attended by the parties and their counsel and the necessary witnesses. She had not accounted for what a small valley does when something that has been done to it in silence finally comes into the open. It shows up. Every chair was filled before 9 o'clock. Ranchers and their wives, merchants, families she recognized from the visits she and Caleb had made over the past 2 weeks, and faces she didn't know who had come because word had spread further and faster than she'd tracked. Pete was there in the suit he clearly owned for funerals, and now for this. Tom, Carl, and Ringo sat in a row, with the scrubbed formal dignity of young men who understood something important was happening and had dressed accordingly. Ed and Margaret Morrison sat in the second row, and Margaret gave Clara a look when she came in that contained more courage and more sorrow and more determination than most speeches. Examiner. Clifford Marsh was exactly what Alcott had described, a compact, gray-haired man from Washington who looked at the room with the clear, unhurried attention of someone who had no social obligations to anyone in it. He called the hearing to order without ceremony and proceeded without waste. Blackwell's lawyer was a man named Whitford from Helena, expensive, polished, and very good. Clara assessed him in the first 10 minutes and found him to be the kind of very good that works best against opponents who are unprepared or emotionally reactive. She filed this information and stayed where she was, composed, attentive, giving away nothing. Alcott opened with the pattern. He did not editorialize. He laid the evidence in front of Marsh the way Clara had organized it, chronological, cross-referenced tight, and let it speak in the language of its own plain facts. Credit dates, acquisition dates, the geographic concentration of affected properties. The name of the traveling witness who appeared in 7 distressed land transfers across 3 territories. Whitford objected 3 times in the first hour. Marsh overruled twice and sustained once, and the sustained objection was technical and changed nothing material. Then the witnesses began. Ed Morrison spoke for 20 minutes, and he did not break. He spoke in the plain, specific, fact-grounded language of a man who has gone over something so many times in his own memory that every detail is worn smooth and certain. He described the letter from Griggs changing his credit terms. He described the timing calving season when cash was at its lowest and need was at its highest. He described the notary's office and the man who had witnessed the lease transfer, and he described the way that man had looked at him across the table with the practiced neutrality of someone doing a job they had done many times before. Margaret Morrison did not testify. She sat in the second row and looked at her husband with the steady, sustaining attention of a woman who had held this family together through 2 years of loss and was now holding it through this, and it was in some ways more powerful than any words she could have said. The Hargrove family followed. Then the Daltons, who had come back from Oregon for this at their own expense, which the room absorbed in silence, and which Marsh noted in his record without comment, but with visible attention. Each testimony added a layer. Each layer fit the one before it with the precision of evidence that has been built on truth rather than constructed for effect. Whitford cross-examined each witness with professional aggression and achieved very little because people who are telling the truth about something they lived through are not easily reconstructed by questions designed to find the gap between their words and their experience. There was no gap. They were the experience. Then Marsh looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I understand you conducted the financial analysis underlying the pattern Mr. Alcott has presented. I'd like to hear it from you directly." This was the moment Blackwell had been preparing for. She knew it before Whitford leaned to say something in his client's ear. She knew it from the quality of the attention in the room, the shift that happens when everyone present understands that the central thing is about to happen. She stood. She walked Clifford Marsh through the evidence, the way she had walked through it 100 times in the north bedroom, in the dark of early morning, not performing, not editorializing, simply moving through the documented truth of what the money showed. Credit dates, acquisition dates, the supply merchant's records, which the subpoena had produced in full, and which confirmed precisely what she had extrapolated from the ranch-side records. The Griggs correspondence with Blackwell's intermediary, careful coded but unambiguous to anyone reading it with full context. She spoke for 40 minutes. She answered every question Marsh asked with the exact information the question called for, no more and no less. When she did not know something, she said so, and cited what the record did show instead. Whitford rose for cross-examination. How was good? She had known he would be good. He came at the analysis from 3 different angles: the reliability of her methodology, the alternative explanations for the patterns she'd identified, and then when those lines of questioning produced less than he needed, he changed terrain entirely. "Miss Whitmore," he said in the reasonable, carefully calibrated tone of a man performing fairness, "can you tell the examiner how long you have been at the Thornton Ranch?" "Approximately 8 weeks," she said. 8 weeks. "And prior to coming to the Thornton Ranch, what was your professional background in financial analysis?" "I managed household accounts, and I resolved a significant debt dispute for my family when I was 17. "Household accounts," Whitford repeated with the practiced inflection that made repetition function as dismissal. "Not professional accounting, not legal training, not formal education in territorial property law." "Correct," Clara said. "And you came to the Thornton Ranch under what arrangement exactly?" Alcott was on his feet. "Examiner, I'd like to understand the relevance." "I'll allow the line," Marsh said. "Answer the question, Miss Whitmore." "I came to the Thornton Ranch," Clara said, "as a prospective partner with the explicit understanding that I would contribute to the ranch's operations in whatever capacity my abilities suited." She kept her voice entirely level. "In 8 weeks, those abilities have included identifying a significant bookkeeping error that would have caused a material financial shortfall, managing the full accounts of the ranch, organizing and executing the evidence collection for this proceeding, and identifying the financial pattern that forms the core of the complaint you are now examining." She paused for exactly one beat. "I did not come with formal credentials. I came with the ability to read what the numbers actually say, which has proven sufficient." Whitford looked at her. She looked back. "Miss Whitmore," he said, shifting again, "are you aware that your own family in your hometown of Millhaven has described you as—" He consulted his notes with the deliberateness of a man making a theatrical point. "Difficult, unpredictable, and prone to conclusions that reflect personal grievance rather than objective analysis." The room went very still. Clara had known this was coming. She had known it since the night Blackwell had gone to her father's bank. She had prepared for it not by building a defense against it, but by deciding precisely what the truth of it was, and saying that instead. "My family," she said, "found me difficult because I was unwilling to perform a version of myself that made other people comfortable at the cost of my own honesty." That is accurate. She met Whitford's eyes without hesitation. "They also, when I was 17, allowed me to save their home using exactly the same analytical approach I have applied to this case. They did not credit me for it at the time, but the record of what I found, and the outcome it produced, exists." She paused. "I have brought you documents, dates, correspondence, sworn testimony, and a subpoenaed record of transactions. Everything I have presented is verifiable and has been verified by Mr. Alcott, who is a trained attorney with 17 years of practice. You are not being asked to trust my character. You are being asked to look at the evidence I found." Another pause. "It says what it says regardless of whether my family found me easy to live with." The room was completely silent. Examiner Marsh was looking at her with the close measuring attention of a man who has just heard something he is going to remember. Whitford sat down. Blackwell testified last, and it was the most instructive 40 minutes of the entire proceeding. He was everything Clara had assessed him to be: polished, reasonable-sounding, genuinely skilled at the performance of innocent perplexity in the face of accusations. He had explanations for each piece of evidence, and the explanations were coherent, and they would have been entirely convincing to someone who had not seen the full pattern laid out in sequence before hearing them. But Marsh had seen the pattern, and Marsh asked questions. The questions were quiet and specific, and came from a man who had read everything in the file and remembered it precisely. And with each answer, Blackwell gave Marsh asked the follow-up that the answer required, and then the follow-up to that, and slowly over 40 minutes, the architecture of careful explanation began to show its load-bearing walls. The places where the story required you to believe in coincidences that kept happening to the same man in the same direction with the same outcome. The traveling witness was the turning point. Marsh asked about him directly by name, with dates, with the list of 7 transactions across 3 territories. Blackwell said he had no knowledge of the man's itinerary and no connection to his appearances at those notary offices. Marsh held up a document. "This is a wire transfer record," he said, "subpoenaed from the Helena Banking Registry, showing a payment from your business account to a Mr. Doyle Marsh. No relation to myself on the date, 3 days following each of the 7 transactions you claim to have no connection to. Can you explain that?" The courtroom heard the silence that followed. It was not a long silence, but it was long enough. "I would need to consult my financial records," Blackwell said, in a voice that had lost its warmth with the speed of a lamp going out. "I have your financial records," Marsh said. "Mr. Alcott subpoenaed them last week." Clara had not known about the wire transfers. Alcott had found them in the final days of preparation and had not told her. Not because he was withholding, but because he had been moving so fast that not everything made it back to the kitchen table before the hearing. She sat very still and kept her face composed, while internally she felt something that was equal parts triumph and the particular satisfaction of watching a structure reveal its own flaws under honest examination. Beside her, she felt Caleb's hand find hers under the table. She held on. Examiner Marsh delivered his preliminary findings at 4 o'clock that afternoon, after a 2-hour recess during which Clara ate nothing, and drank 3 cups of coffee, and sat with Alcott going over contingencies they did not end up needing. The findings were delivered in the flat, precise language of federal procedure, which was in some ways more powerful than any emotional language could have been. The pure weight of official truth, stated without drama, in a room full of people for whom it meant something that had been waited for. Blackwell's claim to prior usage rights on the Thornton North Creek was found to be without foundation. The documented evidence of the Thornton family's continuous usage, supported by Henderson's affidavit and the land registry records, established unambiguous precedent. The claim was denied. The pattern of financial manipulation, the credit timing, the acquisition sequence, the payments to a traveling witness was referred to the federal attorney's office for further investigation. This was not a conviction, but it was the opening of a door that once opened would not close. The Griggs supply operation was ordered to submit all credit records for the past 7 years to the federal examiner's office within 30 days, and Clifford Marsh, before he adjourned the hearing, said something that was not part of official procedure, but that he said anyway, in the tone of a man who has earned the right to speak plainly. The people who brought this complaint, he said, did so at personal cost and with the understanding that it might produce nothing. The quality of the evidence presented today is a direct result of careful, thorough, honest work. This court recognizes that work. He looked at Alcott. He looked at Clara. He moved on, but the room had heard it. What happened outside the courthouse in the 20 minutes after the hearing adjourned was something Clara had no framework for, because nothing in her previous life had prepared her for it. Ed Morrison shook her hand and couldn't find words and didn't need them. Margaret Morrison hugged her, which was unexpected and completely right, and said, 2 years I've been waiting to breathe. The Hargroves, the Daltons who had come from Oregon. Faces she knew and faces she didn't. People from the valley who had watched and waited and were now doing something with their hands and voices that was trying to be equal to what they felt, and falling cheerfully short. Pete stood at the edge of it and watched and said nothing and looked quietly, profoundly satisfied. Tom was talking to one of the Dalton sons with the animated energy of someone who has discovered they live in a world where things like this can happen. And Caleb was beside her as he had been for weeks, not in front of her, not performing anything on her behalf. Just there, the way a mountain is there, solid and real, and entirely committed to remaining. At some point in the middle of all of it, she turned to him and said, "We did it." "You did it," he said. "Don't," she said. "We did it." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "We did it." And then he said very quietly, so that only she could hear, "Marry me." Clara looked at him. "I know the timing is this is not how I planned." He stopped, steadied himself. "I don't have a speech. I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and I don't have a speech because everything I try to say sounds like less than what I mean." He met her eyes directly the way he always met everything that mattered. "You came to this mountain because you had nowhere else worth going. I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel that way again. I want to build something with you, not just the ranch, not just the accounts, not just the legal fights when they come, which they probably will. A breath. Something real. The realest thing I know how to build." Clara Whitmore, who had spent 26 years being told she was too much and not enough in the same sentence, stood on the steps of the Ridgeback Crossing courthouse on the day that everything she had worked for had come true, and looked at this man who had seen her, actually seen her, from a letter written in a plain hand, to a garden in October, to a barn in November, to this, and felt the last wall come down. Not with drama, not with collapse, just down, quietly, permanently. "Yes," she said. He did not make a performance of it. He simply took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead, and then her cheek, and then her mouth, and around them, the valley of people who had gathered on these steps felt the nature of the moment and responded with the instinctive human generosity of people who have just watched something good win, which was noise warmth. Pete Garvey actually laughing out loud for the first time in recorded memory, and Tom throwing his hat in the air with an enthusiasm that sent it directly into someone else's face. Jamais. They were married in December, 6 weeks later, in the snow on the mountain. Not in a church, because Clara had never needed a church for the things she actually believed in. Not with a large ceremony, because neither of them was built for large ceremonies. with Alcott as a witness and Pete as the other witness, and the three ranch hands standing in the cold in their good clothes, and Margaret Morrison in the front, because Clara had asked her specifically, and the mountain around them doing what it always did, holding everything without comment, without judgment, without asking anything in return. The vows were not elaborate. Clara had written hers herself because she was who she was, and what she wrote was this: I promise to tell you the truth, to stand beside you without standing in front of you, to ask for help when I need it, and to give it when you do, and to choose this, you, this life, this mountain every day that I'm capable of choosing. Caleb had written his too, which she had not expected, because he was not a man who wrote things down when he could simply say them. What he had written was, You came to this ranch as a stranger and became the person I cannot imagine living without. I promise to spend my life recognizing your worth in the same way you were never recognized before, not in speeches, but in how I treat what you know and what you do and who you are every ordinary day. She cried, which she had not expected. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she cried with the particular surprised quality of someone whose body has decided to process something faster than their mind. And Caleb handed her his handkerchief without making anything of it, which was exactly right. 3 years later, the federal investigation into Victor Blackwell's operations resulted in a formal finding of fraudulent land acquisition in the Montana Territory. His assets in the region were seized pending resolution of claims from the families he had displaced. The Morrisons received compensation. The Hargroves received compensation. The Daltons, who had moved to Oregon and built a life there, declined to return, but received a formal acknowledgement that what had been done to them was wrong. And Margaret Morrison told Clara later that Ed had cried when the letter came the first time she had seen him cry in 30 years of marriage. Griggs retired from the supply business. His operation was purchased by a consortium of valley ranchers and reorganized under cooperative terms. Carl, who had a head for commerce that surprised everyone, including himself, became its manager at 25. Henderson, who had signed the affidavit, was appointed to a regional land oversight committee by the federal office, and was known for the rest of his career as a man who had recognized early what mattered. James Alcott returned to Helena with a reputation that brought him more significant cases than he could comfortably manage, which was exactly the kind of problem he deserved. And the Thornton Ranch on Ridgeback Mountain became something over those years that Clara had not set out to build, but that grew, the way honest things grow, not by design, but by accumulation of daily choices made in the right direction. The accounts balanced, and then more than balanced. The north pasture stayed in Thornton hands, and the creek ran freely through it, as it had for 30 years. Pete worked until he was 68, and then retired to a house on the south edge of the property that Caleb built for him without asking permission, and Pete accepted without making a production of it, which was the perfect expression of their entire relationship. Tom married the youngest Morrison daughter, which nobody had seen coming, and everyone agreed was obviously inevitable in retrospect. Clara managed the accounts and the correspondence and the ongoing legal relationship with the Federal Land Office and the Valley Cooperative, and did all of it with the same methodical, unornamented competence she had always applied to everything, and was known throughout the valley, not as Caleb Thornton's wife, though she was that, but as Clara Thornton, the woman who had read the money and found the truth, the woman you went to when something needed to be understood and dealt with honestly. Her mother visited once in the second year. She sat in the kitchen of the main house and looked at the life Clara had built, and was for the first time in Clara's memory at a loss for the careful management of her own expression. What came through instead was something undefended. "You're happy," her mother said, with the slightly bewildered quality of someone encountering a fact that rewrites a story they had been telling themselves. "Yes," Clara said. "I didn't think—" Her mother stopped, started again. "I thought you were too difficult for any of this." "I know," Clara said. She poured her mother more coffee. "You were wrong about which things the difficulty was for." Her mother looked at her hands around the cup. "I'm sorry, Clara." It was the plainest thing she had ever said to her. "I know that too," Clara said, and meant it, and let it be enough. Her father wrote every month and always ended the same way. "I am proud of you. which I should have said more and earlier, and I know that. She wrote back every month. That too was enough. Caleb remained through all of it, exactly what he had been in October when he climbed down from a wagon and tied his own horses and looked up and found her watching a man who did what mattered without performing the doing of it, who carried his share and asked her to carry hers, and never confused the two, who said what was true and meant what he said and loved her in the plain, daily, unglamorous, completely reliable way that turned out to be the only kind of love worth having. On an evening in their third year, sitting on the porch in the last of the autumn light, with the mountain enormous and unhurried above them, Caleb said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come?" Clara thought about it honestly. "I think I would have found another way out eventually," she said. "I was not built to stay in a life that small." "And this life," he asked, "is it the right size?" She looked at the mountain. She looked at the ranch spread below them, the fence lines they had ridden together, the north pasture with the creek catching the last of the light, the barn where Pete's lantern was already burning as he did his evening rounds, the house behind them where the kitchen was warm and the accounts were balanced and everything was exactly what it claimed to be. She looked at Caleb Thornton, who had written a letter to a garden in October and offered her a choice, and who had been offering her that same choice every day since, to stay or to go to speak, or to be silent, to be exactly who she was, without apology or amendment. "It's the only size that ever fit," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat together in the fading light while the mountain held the whole of it. The fight and the victory and the loss and the rebuilding and the love that had grown not in grand moments, but in the 10,000 small honest ones. And the stars came out one by one over Ridgeback Mountain, and Clara Thornton, who had once been told by everyone she knew that no one would ever choose her, looked at the life she had built with her own hands and her own mind and her own stubborn, extraordinary heart, and understood that the only person she had ever truly needed to choose her was herself. She had,